Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Professional Development Summit hosted by Adoptee. And we're thrilled to see everyone here for Adoptee Perspectives on DEAI. This is the first of a series of events being held throughout February that brings together AAPI adoptee industry experts like our panelists today for career boosting workshops and insightful conversation. And don't forget, you could win a Burt's Bees gift set. For more information about the rest of the sessions, please see the chat box below. So I'll be your moderator today. My name is Kara Dewhurst. I was adopted from Incheon, South Korea in 1986. And I just want to take one quick second to talk about another organization that I volunteer with. I volunteer with Adoptee Hub, which is another nonprofit that serves primarily Korean adoptees, and we offer a wide variety of post-adoption services. But today I'm here because I'm very passionate about professional development and excited to be moderating this panel. So I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started with some questions. And if any of our audience has any questions, you can write them down, write them in the chat, and we'll leave time at the end to hopefully get to a few of those. So let's get started. And Hannah, why don't you start by telling us where you're adopted from, where you're located, and what you currently do.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's nice to virtually meet you. My name is Hannah Mathis. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I was adopted from South Korea, and I'm currently in Lakewood, Colorado. And I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion work for the state of Colorado and the Department of Labor and Employment. So I'm excited to be here with you today.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. How about Joshua?
Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Kays, he, him, his. I was adopted from Seoul, South Korea, and I am located here in Cincinnati, Ohio. Go Bengals! And then I'm a lead customer service analyst for a software company that works with ESG, workplace safety reporting, and things like that.
Great, thanks, Joshua. And lastly, Jen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Meltretter, she, her, hers. I was adopted from Taiwan in 1990. I currently am the Senior Education Program Manager at Optica, which basically means I do leadership development and diversity and inclusion programming for scientists. I'm also going to plug that I am on the board of directors for Asian Adult Adoptees of Washington, AAAW, and I am Adoptee, which is a mental health resource for adoptees. My job is located in DC, but I now live in Seattle.
Great. So now I'm going to open up some questions for all the panelists, so feel free to just hop in. So maybe tell us a little bit about your interest in DEAI and tell us maybe how you chose that as a career path.
I can get started. I did not originally choose this as a career path. My original idea was to do education, teacher, which kind of morphed into higher education administration. I was working with fraternities and sororities on a couple different campuses. And while I was there, I was formally introduced to DEIA, like there's so many different initials for it now. And actually I was kind of against it just because the way that they were approaching it wasn't very inclusive and wasn't very welcoming. Like it was like, you have to do this and you have to do it now, which is not how I view DEI work in general. So this was not my intended path. I kind of stumbled upon it and it's been really fun and I really like it.
A bit more about me. I here in Cincinnati, I do a lot of community engagement work. I have board membership with quite a few organizations. I work with 3 LGBTQ plus focused organizations, including the Human Rights Campaign here in Cincinnati, an AAPI through National Association of Asian American Professionals, Cincinnati chapter here as a relations chair, a BIPOC dance company, and then also a Spina Bifida Association of Cincinnati. And so I think I just kind of got involved with DEAI because of my community engagement. I really passionate about creating opportunities for community. I think that everybody, no matter what diversity dimension that you align with, everyone wants to be able to feel community in that way. And so I do what I can to try and be involved with that creation of community. And especially with accessibility being included now as a separate kind of facet of a DEI strategy, which I really am appreciative of now lately. Because with people with disabilities, it is a very, very hard battle to fight, to be seen in a public space where that oftentimes is not designed around your experience. And so I'm really passionate about the accessibility aspect of DEI lately, and really excited to see what I could do this coming year for that here in Cincinnati.
I'm so appreciative of this opportunity to get to know the other panelists and hear more about their journeys. It's just lovely. I grew up in Wisconsin. That's where I was adopted to. My parents are white, and so I grew up with a lot of color blindness. We would talk about, and I see the other panelists nodding as well, but my parents would talk about the cultural heritage and food and things like that, but they wouldn't talk about racism. That icky feeling I got when I was dating someone and suddenly it was like, I'm over it. This is something's not right. Or how I felt when people would say, where are you really from? Or, wow, you speak really good English. Right? I didn't have words for that. When I went to graduate school, similar to Jen, it was in the field of education. I wanted to do college access work. I'm getting first-gen low-income kids to college, and I realized in doing that, there was a really high focus on EDI. I hated it in the beginning. I was like, oh, why are we talking about this? And I just worked through all this internalized oppression. But doing that gave me words like microaggressions for how I felt, like internalized racism. And the opportunity to do that now with others and have these taboo conversations is really where I'm finding my cup being filled. So.
Great, thank you all so much for sharing. And I think that was a great introduction, even just to the topic of DEAI. So, and I'm also very excited to talk specifically about, more about adoption, because, how often do we get to talk about the intersection of adoption and some of these issues? So, so I'm wondering, do you think that your identity as an adoptee, and Hannah, you certainly touched on this, shapes your understanding of issues like diversity, accessibility, and inequality?
I think very much so, especially with the diversity dimensions that I'm aligned with. I think growing up, I always tell people that I came out 3 different times, and I had to really come out as proud and valid, or feel validated in each of my 3 diversity dimensions. And it was this really long journey of acceptance where I tackled what I felt was the most visible part of me, was my Asian heritage, and then really find pride in that. But for me, with the intersectionality aspect of it, the difficult part for me was growing up, media representation was huge for me. And I think it's so important. And I'm so glad of the environment that children are growing up in now, where more representation is happening. But for myself, my Asian identity, all of the media stereotypes that I saw on TV were based in martial arts and hyper physical, like masculine environments. And as a person with a disability, that I didn't connect with that idea because of the disability. And so then is the only way for me to be Asian and be proud of being Asian is to have this aspect of something that I didn't feel like I could have. And so then I remember very, very distinctly, was it when swine flu was a thing. And then I had to quarantine for like a week or something like that because of it. And during that time, I binge watched Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which I would never ever recommend anybody doing when they're quarantining from a flu. But watching B.D. Wong's character George Wong on that show was very, very powerful and impactful for me, because it was the first time that I can remember in my life seeing a representation of an Asian American that wasn't rooted in this hyper masculine, hyper physical world and stereotype. And so I think that that really like the intersectionality really played a huge role. And that was just one example of all the diversity things that I experienced. I have a very large family of 18 brothers and sisters. And most of us are adopted, a lot of us from Korea, but a lot of us have disabilities as well. And so I always kind of grew up in intersectionality in my household, but it was one of those things where I had to see that externally to be able to make sense of it.
I really appreciate Joshua's point of view because I didn't think of it that way. And that's what I love about this, because it's a continuous journey of learning. And so to think of like the hypermasculine, hyperphysical, like for me, my visual representation was Michelle Kwan and figure skating. And that's what made me start skating, because I was like, oh, she's doing it, so I guess that means that I should. But it's like eye-opening in a way to hear that the hyperphysical is really a thing. And it was something I never thought about. So I really appreciate Joshua for you sharing your experience. I think, and similar to what he said too, like it's only been in the past few years that I've really started this as what it's known as coming out of the fog and this adoptee journey. If I'm being completely honest with myself, I mean, I've always viewed myself as a white person on the inside, but of course that's not how society sees me. And so just like Joshua, like I'm on my journey now of understanding what it means to be an Asian American woman and those cultural aspects of it as well, especially like this was my first Lunar New Year that I tried Taiwanese food for the first time, and I'm like 30 something years old. So it took a while, but we're getting there. So, but I think being an adoptee, it almost like it doesn't allow you to fully understand who you really are and who you really can be. It takes some time because you have to be accepting of who you are before you can even start about thinking all the other identities that are surrounding you. So yes, adoptee plays a huge part in your journey, I would say.
Really appreciate the vulnerability of my co-panelists, as well as the intersectionality that they've discussed. And I'm going to take it a slightly different way as I think about shaping my understanding in these issues. It's that as an Asian adoptee, we sit in this really interesting space of fake privilege, right? Where we're allowed to feel white enough if we are with our parents or our families or our white friends. But as some of us may have learned during the anti-Asian hate crimes, right? Like we are still very much Asian. And so a lot of times, because the violence towards us is lower or more acceptable through microaggressions, we don't talk about the fact, for instance, the Asian ceiling, right? That although Asians are quick and highly likely to get into these entry-level positions, when it comes to leadership roles, it's like there's that glass ceiling that women face because we're not viewed as creative or assertive enough or having the ability to lead because we're just number crunchers. And so I think that being an adoptee, we sit in both spaces. We see the privileges of those around us and we love those around us who do have a lot of privilege, right? White privilege, but we also know what it's like to be oppressed. And then being Asian on top of that means that our oppression is often invalidated, right? We're not as bad as others. And so we get to like transverse this really interesting peak, if you will. And I think that allows us to see the world in more than black and white, but all the different shades of nuance that come with it.
Wow, that was great. And these are issues that I think will resonate with a lot of adoptees and specifically Asian adoptees. So let's shift a little bit and talk about your own workplaces. So would you describe your workplaces as being diverse? And do you feel like there is AAPI visibility and positions held in your own organizations?
I can start. It's an interesting question because there's a lot of layers to that question. My workplace is diverse in some aspects. DC has a very big LGBTQIA community, so I do work with a lot of men who identify as gay. But like in terms of AAPI representation, not in a staff headquarters, but in my membership, yes, because they're scientists. There's a lot of different layers to that question. So in terms of adoptees, I'm the only adoptee on staff that I know of. Our exec team does not have any person that has a young child in their family. So sometimes there's that disconnect. I have a young child, so they don't understand the things that I have to do. And I'm also the only woman of color on my specific team. So like there's so many different aspects to it that it's kind of hard to answer. It depends.
I just started at my company back in November. We have a international company, and so there is an office in India, but here in Cincinnati, the office here, it's not, I wouldn't say it's super diverse, but I've in a really interesting position now where the company that I came from was really, really diverse and very intentional about DEI work. And my current company knew that I was involved in a lot of that work with employee resource groups and stuff like that in a previous company. And so I'm getting an opportunity to help kind of highlight diversity in that way, and by helping to create a kind of a strategy for an employee research group around diversity. So even though it doesn't seem as diverse right now, the hope is that I get to be a part of what that change might look like here in Cincinnati.
Josh, I appreciate that you mentioned employee resource groups. And so I helped create sort of the network for that. Each group is led by a member of that community. But even though I'm leading it, the Asian American Pacific Islander group has always been the last one to be built. There isn't one at this state at this point. At Denver Public Schools is the last one before I left there that was really pushed on. A lot of folks, I think, still are of that mindset of just put your head down, do the work, don't make waves, assimilate if we are able to. And so it's not something that is super visible, and it's also more difficult, of course, with virtual work.
So I'll just add that, it is also really dependent on what industry you're in too. So, I'll just say real quickly that I'm in the environmental industry, which has traditionally been very white. Just the environmental movement in general has been very white. But I hope things are changing, and I always just love to see young people of color getting involved in things like, environmentalism. And in my organization, that's pretty white. Coincidentally, I happened to meet another Korean adoptee at my company, so that was, very exciting. So, on this same topic, do you feel like you've ever experienced racial or gender stereotyping in the workplace? And if so, how did you handle it?
Definitely. So I lead conversations around DEI work. And what I found is that the more assertive and aggressive I was, the lower my scores in my ratings in my post survey were. But when I was bubbly and cute and fit into that Asian stereotype, my scores were amazing. And so I think it's deciding where I was willing to bet. Was I willing to play into that stereotype, even though it did help my job? Or was I able to push at it? And so I kind of hit a happy medium. I actually used that in part of my introduction. Like, if you're feeling uncomfortable with the way that I'm showing up, I want you to think about why. Is it because I'm not bubbly and I don't make you feel comfortable? Is it because you don't expect someone who is an Asian woman to show anger or frustration or negative emotions? And so that was one of the ways. But again, these stereotypes constantly pop up, and I think it's something that we will always have to navigate and negotiate.
A lot of my career and work history has been in the IT industry, doing support and analyst work and things like that. And so I think just automatically, like you were saying, Hannah, that idea of fake privilege existing within the Asian stereotype, I think that I've had to deal with a lot of that within my work history as well. And it almost feels like this idea that there's this pressure to perform above and beyond what people already feel like your baseline should be, right? Even though they intentionally in their minds have set the bar higher for you just because of your race, right? And so I do find that, especially in a couple of my jobs, that I had to really fight against that extra pressure that was being added, because the level that I was performing was already and excelling, but my scores, like you were saying, Hannah, were very much not reflective of that, because I think it was this idea, even though it was never stated, but I always got the sense that the bar was a little bit higher for me and that I had to work a little bit harder for that. When you were talking earlier about that, the glass ceiling and things like that, one of my favorite AAPI individuals, Eugene Lee Yang, right after the Atlanta attacks against the Asian community, did this huge, great documentary. I'll post the YouTube link in the chat here for everyone to watch, but it is an incredible documentary that talks about that privilege and about how you want the representation when it comes to executive rooms and Asian representation. It's often where we should be grateful to be in the room because we pass as this model minority kind of idea. But then that we're expected to stay silent, and especially for women in those boardrooms, that the expectation is to be seen and not heard. And that can be so dangerous, right? And it's like, what are we trying to aspire to if once we get to where we want to go, we're not expected to or desired to give our opinions or give our insights, right? And so I think that that's kind of the difficult battle that as we start to try and climb, that we'll continually be fighting against, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting, Hannah, what you brought up earlier of like, oh, you're not bubbly. Like I am not a bubbly person as well. So I find that recently, I've been telling people, because I grew up in New Jersey, like I'm from New Jersey. I don't sugarcoat things. I say it to you straight. Like it can be very off-putting for some people, but that's just kind of how I grew up. That's how I talk. So I found that like I've had to add that so that people understand where I'm coming from too. Like you might not know someone from New Jersey, but you understand, okay, like I grew up in a different area where, you know, we just say things to your face and it can be very abrasive at sometimes. But yeah, I mean, put gender and race and all of the different identities that you face, and yeah, you know, it happens on a daily basis. I think for me, with the second question of how do I handle it, sometimes I don't, because sometimes I don't realize it's happening at the time it's happening. And so then I realize as I get home and I, you know, think about my day, I'm like, oh, that happened. And I should have said something. And I'm like, you know, hurting myself in a way where it's like, oh, I wish I did, regretting it. But, you know, sometimes you don't recognize that it's happening right in the moment, and it's okay, you know, as long as you can recognize it after the fact and try and figure out ways where you can maybe stand up for yourself or build that confidence to stand up for yourself, I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you guys, you know, so much. And again, I think these are things that will resonate, with a lot of people. And I think, for those of us who were raised in not only in white families but in white communities, we're used to navigating white spaces, and then sometimes we'll have a moment where it's like we almost forget, right? And then I've had moments where I've looked around and then suddenly realized that maybe I'm the only non-white person in the room, and that didn't really occur to me. And then I think about how does that shape how people are interacting with me, So thank you so much. And moving on to talk a little bit more specifically about adoption. So adoption can be a very, I would say, personal and emotional topic. Have you guys ever had any instances where the topic of adoption comes up in your work life?
I think for me, it doesn't come up so much now as it did when I was in higher education, because I was working with undergraduate students and there was family days, there was mom's day and dad's day. And we were talking about families and I just said, you know, you have to recognize that family structures are very different from person to person. And so to label it as a mom's day or a dad's day can be triggering for some people, and to recognize that family structures aren't always the norm of mom, dad, child. So that's when I was really starting to push back on things like that and wording, because some wording really does matter. But I don't quite face, at least with my adoptee identity. I'll tell it to members that I get to know very well, but that's pretty much it.
Any other panelists want to share?
I think it's so interesting. Often it hasn't been the same level of personal, sort of personal questions and things like that that I got in like elementary school. Is that your mom? That doesn't look like your mom. Like those things, like that's not in the workplace. Instead, I think because I'm in a helping service, it really comes up with savior mentality and that idea of like, okay, well, we're working with this foster home that's doing X, Y, or Z, or like, yay, we love adoption. It's so wonderful. And so they miss that nuance. And so that's the negative side. I think the positive side though is really working with young people and being able to own my, not just Asian identity, but this Asian adoptee identity. I was sitting with a group of kids that I was coaching at one point, a group of Asian girls. And I mentioned like, oh yeah, I'm adopted. And it was like one by one, they lit up and they're like, me too, me too. And they had this connection as if it was like, okay, like they got it. And suddenly like they started saying hi to me more often, even though I wasn't their direct coach. And just having that opportunity, I think about how lovely it would have been to have a role model or a person in my life like that. And so to be able to see young people who I can be that for was like on the opposite side, like really positive and really filling for me in my cup.
So I'll just add that I just adoption generally, I think is more common than we realize. And I've constantly and continually, I've been in and out of, you know, lots of different jobs, and I'm always surprised. I feel like there's always at least one adoptee in the room, and, you know, maybe we don't, it's not kind of a topic of conversation, you know, but it does come up. And, but the other context in which it, you know, it might come up is, you know, you might have an adoptive parent, right, that you, you know, work with. And so that can be a little bit of a tricky situation. You know, they're coming at it maybe from a different perspective. So, you know, I've had to kind of learn the hard way to tread cautiously, right? You know, kind of dip my toe into a conversation, and, you know, if I feel like we're just not gonna see eye to eye, you know, then it's like, all right, we don't need to talk about that at work. So yeah, so thanks for sharing. So back to, you know, talking about DEAI work. So throughout your career, have you noticed people becoming more or less receptive to diversity and equity efforts, and, you know, especially in today's, you know, political climate? How have you seen it change, you know, let's say maybe over the past 5 years?
I think that one, with the racial equity work that's being done right now. It's obviously an unfortunate byproduct of all of the attacks against Black men and women by police in the country. But then also for the accessibility aspect of it, the pandemic has really highlighted accessibility as well. When we think about the pandemic, we don't realize the huge positive impact that it has on people with disabilities until you think about the fact that the journey to my home office here is a lot shorter than me getting into a car and driving 40 minutes to the office. And you've heard it said, I'm sure multiple times now, that the people with disabilities are now finding relief in these opportunities where we were told for years and years and years that our job had to be done in person. We had to make that drive into the office. And if we were experiencing a bad pain day, like for someone like myself that experiences chronic pain, then I would have to expend my own personal vacation time that's supposed to be a benefit to me in order to be able to go ahead and have that rest or have that moment of self-healing that I need to be able to go ahead and still operate. And so I think that we are seeing it right now, just because we're forced into it, and two, we're finding enough people are realizing that it's an important discussion. I was just having a conversation with someone the other day about how I think we're seeing the world less as a binary world, which I think is helping as well. And so it's less black and white. It's less I'm not a racist or you are a racist kind of a thing. It's more like, okay, well, this is a spectrum. Where am I on the spectrum, and how can I get more towards that anti-racist part of that spectrum, anti-ableist part of that spectrum? I'm finding personally with the disability advocacy that conversation is a lot more difficult for people to understand, that ableism is more prevalent in our society than people realize. And so one of the things I just actually posted last night on social media, there was this People article, and they used the word normal in this conversation about these conjoined twins that were separated. You see that all the time when it comes to this posture, that the desirable and the best situation to be in is an able, normative, non-disabled situation. And then anything outside of that is abnormal, it's weird, it's strange, it's odd, it's something to be avoided. And so I posted, let's normalize not using the word normal when it comes to this desired posture, because it's super ableist and it's very, very oppressive when it comes to people with disabilities. When we see that, it certainly doesn't make us feel good, or anyone that I know that has a disability. And so I think that now that we are finally coming to the table and having some of these conversations, I think now we need to do the work where we challenge ourselves to continue to further that conversation into more. And that's why I love that accessibility has been included, because for so long, accessibility has been tied to aging, and it's just simply not true. One form Americans experience disability in one form or another. When you go above 65, yes, that becomes 1 in every 2. But accessibility is so prevalent, but we're not seeing any work done because people with disabilities aren't able to access the public space. And so the work that we really need to do now, I think, with the accessibility aspect of it is allies stepping up to the plate and helping us to access those spaces that sometimes we physically can't access to have that platform.
That was so great, Josh. Thank you. I'm thinking about, I think I might be a little more cynical than you. I think the conversation has been opened, but I also think that it has become more performative. And so I think that, and again, this is just amusing, but it'll be interesting to see sort of where this turns. And so for a while it was, okay, well, racism is just like being mean to someone. And then you had civil rights where it was like, okay, well, we can't segregate anymore. It's not okay to do X, Y, and Z. And so then we moved into color blindness. Now we're saying color blindness isn't okay. And so what I'm sort of expecting to see, because people don't have a fully formed understanding of why we're helping some groups and not others, right, is that the next sort of layer of that will move more into saviorism. Like we're going to name it and we're going to say that we pity you. And so then we're not going to hold the standards as high. And so I think it's going to shift, and it'll be interesting sort of how it shifts. And yeah, I totally agree, Josh. Like in the chat box, he wrote, very performative. Lots of companies came out strong with commitment to DEIA and have made very little progress. I think I saw something like $6 billion were promised and something like 2.3 million were spent or something like that overall. So it is, yeah, the performative piece is very real.
I would just add on top of Hannah's remarks is DEI work is about facing how you grew up, the structures that you grew up around, and breaking those down and understanding that it's okay to have a different experience than other people. And so there's a Forbes article that recently came out that said that companies are starting to they prefer white DEI consultants or professionals versus people of color, because people of color will point out what's wrong. And so it's that feeling of comfortableness that they're not willing to go above and beyond and actually do the work. Which I found very interesting, because if you're serious about it, then you're willing to hear, listen, that's actually not right. It's not the best way of going about it. And here's why you should really be doing this. Like saying that, okay, I need to unlearn and relearn in a different way. So I think that's something that hopefully will be the next step, but I think we still have a very long way to go.
Great, thank you guys so much. And that, yeah, that was really helpful. And you know, we hear the word, you know, performative a lot, and so that brings me to the next topic, which is kind of the criticism about the DEI industry, you know, generally. You know, I see a lot of people who are very critical of things like, you know, anti-bias training, and, you know, whether or not, you know, it's effective. So if you have thoughts kind of on about the criticism of the industry as a whole, you know, feel free to share. But within your own organizations, can you share maybe, you know, efforts or specific, you know, tactics that you think are impactful and effective at creating equitable and inclusive spaces?
Can you say the first part of your question again?
Oh, you know, we were talking about, you know, kind of more performative kinds of, you know, DEI work, and you know, I just wanted to bring up that, you know, I am aware of a lot of the criticism of the DEI industry, right? So if you have any thoughts about that, feel free to share. But like I said, specifically, I want to talk about maybe, you know, things that you found that you think are effective.
I think one criticism I have is the fact that companies are elevating specifically Black people as DEI people when it's not their, like, if they want to do that, then that's amazing, but it shouldn't be forced upon them. That there's probably a way better way of expressing this that I'm not doing right now, but I was talking with some colleagues about that, you know, you can have a person of color in an executive role outside of the DEI space, and that's perfectly fine. They don't always need to be solely in the DEI space. And I think that's one criticism that I have, because when you see these announcements of like, oh, we have a vice president of DEI, you know, I just wonder, like, the hidden meetings behind why they really hired that person, and making sure that that space is comfortable for that new VP to actually make the changes that they want to make, which leads to criticism of my own work. You know, like, we do a very good job at trying to make an inclusive environment for our members, but we don't do that for our staff, for me as a staff member. So you have to really think about all the different audiences that you're interacting. It's not just the members, it's not just the people paying our salaries, but it's also those who are dedicating their time, their energy, and their effort to making these things happen for these members. So I think that's one thing that I would say, at least.
I think that that Jen, you bring up a really good point. It is a very fine line when it comes to who is going to be the one to lead your DEAI efforts. I'm controversial in a way where I feel like where I say that I don't think a straight white man should be leading anyone's DEAI efforts at all. But again, I might be a bit controversial in that way. But you know, it is that fine line between finding the right fit for a position like that, right? But then also making sure that you're not tokenizing an individual for their race, for their diversity dimension in that work, right? Because like you said, then that just adds an extra unneeded layer of pressure. It also comes to the conversation about the onus isn't on, there shouldn't be on the marginalized or oppressed group to then teach others about that oppression, right? And to bring others along, right? If someone has space, and we all have, sounds like here on this panel, all are safely doing so within our own capacities, but it shouldn't be something that should be expected of any of us to be able to do that. And I often find a lot of times in the situations where I'm trying to fight really hard for speaking about my disabled experience, that I've met a lot of opposition from people. I can remember very strongly, I walk around the community with crutches. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when people step on my crutches, not watching where they're going. And so I was at a venue or a bar with a friend, or I wouldn't call them a friend anymore, but with an individual, and someone had walked by us and stepped on my crutch. And by that point, it had been like the 12th person maybe that evening around the different places I had been that had done so. And finally, I just got to a breaking point. I was just super frustrated, and I vented my frustration to that person. And then that person fought me on this idea that I need to calm down. I'm overreacting. This is this, that, and the other. And I tried to explain, well, no, it's like someone stepping on your feet. How would you feel if someone was stepping on your feet? Because I ambulate with this. He's like, it's not the same thing. I'm like, it is. But then eventually you reach a point where you're just like, okay, well, this conversation is going nowhere, and you are committed to this idea of not understanding. And so I think that's that dangerous line, like we talked about, where hiring the right person, but then also making sure that person is willing and has the ability to do that. But then also, like you said too, making sure that your entire board is diverse, right? One of the first things I look at when if I'm looking at a new job is I go directly to the company's website and look at their executive board. And is there diversity on their executive board? Is there gender diversity? Is there racial diversity? You know, is there, or is it all one single color? And if it is, then it might not be a good fit for me, because, you know, truly a movie that I love, Remember the Titans, one of the lines is attitude reflects leadership. And so if your leadership is one race, even though they all might be very, very invested in social commentary, right, and change and things like that, it's still one of those things where people are going to see that from the top. And if there's no intention when it comes to diversity at the top, then what does that look like for the people at the bottom?
Okay. And to add to that, I think it's so interesting when people say like these workshops don't work. I think it's really important to look at two aspects of the work. Number one, oftentimes you hire one person, an office of one, to lead this work, and they have all of the accountability, right? Did it work? Yes or no? And it's on them. When really, were they set up to succeed? Were they given the power, the influence, the seats at the table, the voice, the space for their voice? Was it prioritized, or was it, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we have other things to do? The other thing is it's often measured through this white supremacist mindset. So if you look at Tamil Kuhn's white supremacist tenets, it's like, are we measuring them in ways that make sense? Or are we expecting to be able to measure them like outcomes for business or sales or something like that? I think that as we think about things that really do work, it's employee resource groups. How do we get employees to come together and not just saying, yay, we have employee resource groups, these are great, they come together and we give them a safe space, like, great. And that's sort of bullshit, because you also want to look for your employee resource groups to have access to power, access to leadership, access to changing policy, so that they can say, hey, so it's great that we came together, but we realized that X, Y, and Z doesn't work for us, right? Our biggest like sales day, or when we're trying to hit our quota, falls directly on a really big holiday for a number of our employees. How are we going to shift that, right? Because those groups have the opportunity to shift the culture, and Josh and Jen had mentioned it earlier, like highlight some of the things that are uncomfortable and that those with privilege don't see, but they have to be empowered to do so and given that access to have their voices uplifted.
Great. Well, I think we could sit here and talk about this all day, and it's fascinating, but I do want to make sure that we have time for some audience questions. So the first question is, what advice would you have given your younger self when starting out in the workplace?
I recently, this past year, was given a great piece of advice, and that's it's just as important to take space as it is to give space. And so don't ever be afraid to take space in the world, because you're taking space is very, very important. There's a poem by Marianne Williamson that I've always loved. It's called Our Deepest Fear. But it says there's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure about around you. We were all meant to shine, and as you let your own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fears, our presence automatically liberates others. And that to me is very, very strong and very, very powerful to me. The idea that my taking space in whatever capacity I'm able to at that point in time could potentially be giving someone else that ability to do so as well. And so take space in the world.
I so agree with that. And I would add, take space in these DEI conversations. There was such a long time when I was like, I'm not oppressed enough. Like, I don't know, my parents spoke English, my parents are white, like I had a lot of privilege. Where is my voice seat at the table? Like, do I fit? Why should I have these conversations? Like, it's Black men who are being murdered, not me, right? And I don't have white privilege, so I can't talk to the white folks. And it's reminding, I think the advice that I would have given to my younger self would be, your experience and experiences with oppression are nuanced and valid. And you can help with this shift and help the fight by not staying quiet.
Any of our other panelists?
Nope, they covered everything. No need to elaborate.
Yeah, I think that was great. That's great advice. Any other questions from our attendees? Oh, great. So the next question is, coming from a woman of color, how would you go about negotiating a raise? That's a great question. Even though I'm a college freshman, I'm nervous about how the intersectionality of my race, including racial stereotypes and gender, might affect this interaction.
I don't have an answer because I'm still working on this skill, but I just have to say kudos to the person who asked that question, because the fact that you're a college freshman and you know that you need to negotiate, I did not negotiate for my first job. I was too scared and I wish I had. So the fact that you already know that, just props to you.
Something that's really helped me is I have a group of girlfriends who are all white women and well-educated, who we come together and we have a career circle. And what that means is we talk about these things. How do we ask for maternity leave? How long is maternity leave? How do we ask for a promotion? Like all these things that feel taboo and like we're getting quote unquote uppity, right? Or that we're not grateful. And I think that's an issue that adoptees have of, are we grateful enough? We should just be happy that we're here because we were saved. And so having like that group that's in a similar space to me, to be able to bounce ideas off of, to be reined in like, nope, I think that your boss was totally fair on that, Hannah. Or, ooh, they said what? No, you should definitely be upset. Like that's a nice temperature gauge to see, okay, what is happening? And have someone help level set. And sometimes like one of my friends went for a promotion 6 months before I did. And then I was going in it in a very different field, but I was like, oh, I remember what we talked about. This is helpful. I know what to expect in this next chapter of my life. So find friends and be vulnerable with them. Share this stuff.
I think that when Kelsey is saying know your worth in the chat there, that's very, very important too. But then also have the ability, whether you keep a journal of sorts, but really be able to, first of all, one of my friends who's an HR professional says you always negotiate for salary no matter what. He says every single job that he's ever, or promotion that he's ever gone for, he's always, no matter if they paid him what he was expecting or not, he always asked for more. And then also in conjunction with that though, being able to go back to whatever journal that you have of the accomplishments and things that you've done in the last quarter or the last year, to be able to say, this is the reason why I'm not just asking you for a bunch of money out of the blue. These are the reasons why I'm asking for more money, and make it evidence-based and make it data-based.
So thank you everyone for such an insightful and thought-provoking conversation. I learned a lot today, and I hope everyone has, some sort of takeaway, from today's panel. So, and thank you also to the audience for bringing such thoughtful questions. We're going to wrap up, and we're going to take a short, about 10-minute break, 5-minute break maybe. If you're joining us for the Young Professionals panel, that'll be starting in just a few moments. You'll get to meet our young professional AAPI adoptees and learn about their careers from college to becoming a working professional. And we'll discuss transitions, mentorship, and challenging work environments. So thanks a lot. And if you're sticking around, I'll see you in a few minutes. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.